Hi, my name is Christina Narushevitz, and I am the Assistant Registrar at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. My educational background is kind of mixed. I got my bachelor's in fine arts, so I actually got an emphasis in sculpture. And then after that, I was working as an artist with artwork in galleries, but times were tough and I needed to supplement my income a little bit. So I decided to go back to school and get my master's degree. And I wondered, what can I do to build off of my education that I already have? And I decided the museum field. It's something I've always loved ever since I was a kid, and it combines my love of art and history and all these really cool things. So I got a master's degree in museum studies. The reason I got into this field is because I really love working in museums. It sort of plays on this childhood craving that I always had when I would go into the museums. I always wanted to get closer to the objects. I always wanted to know more about them, where they came from, how exhibits were made. So that's why I pursued the museum field. And the reason I ended up here at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art is because it combines a lot of my different interests, and art tells a story. And so there are always really fascinating stories happening in the building here that I get to learn about constantly. I'm always learning in this field. My typical day is never the same. That's one of the things that I love about working in the museum field is you need a lot of different skill sets because you're going to be doing lots of different things every day. And that is especially true if you work in a smaller museum because they're going to have smaller staff. So you might be the person greeting visitors, selling tickets, and also curating shows. My typical day here, it can be anything from doing some data entry, working in our databases for a couple hours, and then I go down to the vault and maybe I take some artwork out of frames. I check them for damage, I label them, I track where they're stored. Some days I'm helping install exhibits or schedule transactions of art loans and things like that. So every day is different. The traits that I think are essential to working in a museum is a love of learning, because you're going to constantly be learning new things, new skills for your job. That's one thing. Maybe new technologies, new archival treatments and things like that if you're working with objects. But you're also going to be learning about whatever it is that your museum educates about, and there is a museum out there for everything. So if you're someone who's into comic books, there's a comic book museum out there for you. If you're somebody who's really into space, there's a space museum out there for you. And every time you put on an exhibit or educational programming, you're learning about that as well. And so I think it's really important that you have an innate love of learning. The process for creating an exhibit in a museum depends on the type of exhibit it is. So every museum has their own collection, usually. Sometimes it's really small, sometimes it's millions of objects. So you can make an exhibit from your own collection, the things that you already have in-house, or sometimes you can borrow an exhibit from another museum. It's kind of like almost like the library. So you can call up a friend, call up the Getty and say, hey, I'd really like to borrow a couple of art pieces or maybe a whole exhibit that you guys have already organized. Can we do that? Can we figure something out? So once you kind of get the general idea of what kind of exhibit you want, it's just about gathering the objects, gathering the artwork, figuring out what the story is, and then telling that story. So the most challenging aspect about working in museums is like a lot of jobs in the arts and humanities, it's something that you pursue because of passion, not because of money. And that is sort of top to bottom an issue within the museum field. So you're not going to be making a ton of money usually, and you also might experience some lean times in working in a museum in terms of your museum having trouble finding funding. And that's really important to put on those education programs, those exhibits and things like that. So if you're listening to this and you're not interested in going into the museum field, I would encourage you to visit museums because that helps support your museums. Some of my favorite exhibits are ones that talk about history. I love seeing artifacts and tools that people used in their lives every day because it helps me sort of feel connected to the past. So fairly recently, the museum here had an exhibit on Pompeii, and one of the most popular objects in that exhibit were the pigments, just little containers of pigment powder. And people would gather around and look at that because they were so intrigued to know that at one point that was paint that someone used. So I really like to see those objects that I know somebody else held in their hands, even if it was 50 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you're connecting with them. One of the things that I think is really powerful about museums, whether it's a natural history museum or a comic book museum or an art museum, is that they all tell stories, and the story is about how we are all connected in some way. So if you go into a natural history museum and you're seeing Native American basketry from 200 years ago, the intention there is that you are going to walk away and feel a little bit connected to that culture and understand it a little bit better. And that's the same for an impressionist painting. When you get into a museum and you see a work of art in front of you, I would encourage visitors not to just look at it and think, that's cool. Think about the person who made it. Think about what their intention was there. Were they trying to tell a story? Were they just trying to make a tool to make their lives easier? All of that is really something that we as humans today deal with, right? We have toothbrushes and paintbrushes, we write stories, we make movies, and all of those things, all of those elements are not too dissimilar from people 50 years ago, 1,000 years ago, what have you.